So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how to determine if your inverse is a function with only looking at the original. Okay, so that way we don't have to necessarily do the flipping of x and y and examining those values. So a function is one-to-one for a and b in the domain where a is not equal to b, and that implies that the f of a, so the y value at a, is not equal to f of b, or the y value at b. In other words, two different x's can't have the same y. So to be one-to-one, two different x values cannot have the same y. So in the example we saw earlier, this relation here would not be one-to-one. So to tell if a function is one-to-one from its graph, do the horizontal line test. If a horizontal line intersects with a graph at only one y value, at only one y value, then the function is one-to-one. A function has an inverse f inverse if and only if it is one-to-one. So something that would be one-to-one, I'm going to go back to our pictures that we had earlier here today. So if I was going to take a horizontal line through something like this, that is something that's one-to-one because I only crossed one time. I could do the same thing if I just had a line. I know if I did a horizontal through all that, it would be one-to-one because I only crossed one time. If I go back to my parabola from the earlier example and I do a horizontal line test, I know that that is not one-to-one, so its inverse would not be a function. That doesn't mean it doesn't have an inverse. It just means that the inverse is not actually a function. All right. We are going to actually look at example 13 here, and we're going to determine if the graph of that is a function. If so, determine if it is one-to-one. So first of all, we have to determine if the original is a function. So that's where I would do the vertical line test. So it passes the vertical line test. So I would say original is function. And then we have to determine if it's one-to-one. So I'm going to go the other direction. I'm going to use the horizontal line test. And I would say it's one-to-one because it passes the horizontal line test. All right. I'm going to look at example 14. I'm going to do the vertical line test to determine if it's a function. So I would say original is function. And then I'm going to do the horizontal line test to see if it's one-to-one, and it's definitely not one-to-one. It crosses like 3 times. So it's not 1, 2, 1. All right. The next one this is actually one that's super important for calculus. So we are going to look at if these, so if we see the inverse in there, okay, so if we see this notation, we know that the value inside is a y value. If we don't see that notation, we know the value inside is an x value. So that determines what we go look for on the graph, okay? So I'm seeing the y value I've seen that it's a y value. So I'm going to go to the y value of 0, which I know is along here. And I'm going to read the x value off the graph. And it looks like that x value is maybe at 3.5. All right, on B, it says inverse, so that means I know that this is a y value. So I'm going to go to where the y value is 0, which is along here. And I'm going to read the x value off the graph, which looks like at about 2.5. Now we're doing a function composition. So we're going to read things off the graph based on the function composition. So we're going to go to, and notice there's no inverse, so this is an x value. So I'm going to go to where the g's x value, so the x value would be along here, is 1. And I'm going to read off the graph that x value is -2. So I have f of -2. So I'm going to go, again, there's no inverse on it, so I know that that's an x value. So I'm going to go to the x value of -2. And I'm going to read the y value off the graph, which looks like it is at 1. I'm going to do some erasing on my graphs. All right, again, I'm going to rewrite this as g of f of 4. There's no inverses, so we know that these are both x values. So I'm going to put the x value of 4 into the graph. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm supposed to be on the f graph, f of 4. 1, 2, 3. I think 4 is supposed to be like right there. And oops, I lost my notes. All right. And we are at -1. So that looks like it's about -1. So g of -1. Then we're going to go the x value of -1 on the g graph. And it looks like we are still at -1. Okay, let's look at now. This time, notice we're mixing the x values and the y values this time. So this time it says I'm going to put an x value into g. So I'm going to go to the g graph and go to 3. So 1, 2, 3. And when I read that off, it looks like we are at 1. So I have f inverse of 1 gets substituted in here. So I know that that is a y value. So I'm going to go to the f graph. I'm going to go to the y value of 1. And I'm going to read off the x value. And you'll notice that this time I actually have 2 answers. So it looks like it is both -2 and about 3.5. Okay, let's look at f of 3. So we've got the x value of 3. So I'm going to go to my f graph and go to 3. And we've got 1, 2, 3. All right. And then we're going to look at the y value because we have the inverse. We're going to have to look at the y value of 3 on the g graph. So 1, 2, 3. And when I read that off the graph, I'm going to read the x value off the graph. And it's probably not quite at 4. It's probably at like 3.7-ish. All right. We're going to do a couple more. So I'm going to rewrite it as g of f inverse of 4. So we know that this has to be a y value because I have an inverse. So we've got 4, or y value of 4 on the f graph. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to go to the graph and I'm going to read the x value off the graph, which looks like -3. Now there's no inverse on this one, so we know that this is an x value. So I'm going to go to the g graph and I'm going to go to 1, 2, oops, wrong way. 1, 2, -3. And I'm reading that off the graph and it looks like we're kind of halfway in between. So we are at -3.5. All right, and then I'm going to rewrite h. So we've got f of g inverse of 4. And this is we have an inverse function there, so that's going to be a y value. So I'm going to go to 4 on the g graph on the y's. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to read that off the graph, which looks like it's at 4. And this time it looks like we don't have an inverse, so I know that this input is an x value. And so we're going to go to 4 on the x. 1, 2, 3, 4. And our y value equals -1.